$34,000 stolen in the dead of night, then a $50,000 shadow debt shackled to my name. The bank manager slid the digital audit log across his mahogany desk and pointed to the forged signature. My mother later patted my arm, called it a temporary bridge loan, and told me to stop being selfish. My father poured a scotch and said, "Family always comes first." I did not throw a fit. I did not cry. I am a financial compliance officer. I hunt corporate fraud for a living. I picked up the printed IP logs, walked out of their house, and set a trap that cost them everything. Before I go on, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Linda Vengeance, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. And drop a comment. How old are you, and where are you watching from? My name is Euphemia Taylor. I am 31 years old. Let me take you back to 48 hours before the confrontation. It was a Tuesday morning in Albuquerque. Rain lashed against my home office window. The room smelled of dark roast coffee and damp earth. I sat at my desk, looking at the faded World Cup bracket pinned to my corkboard. I had filled it out 12 years ago. It was a promise I made to myself, a trip to Madrid. For years, I funneled every bonus, every tax refund into a legacy savings account. I clicked the final confirmation button on the travel agency website. The screen buffered. A red banner dropped down. Transaction declined. Insufficient funds. I opened a new tab. My fingers struck the keyboard, logging into my banking portal. The screen loaded. Available balance, $0.00. The air in the room grew thin. I refreshed the page. The zero remained. I scrolled down to the transaction history. A single outgoing wire transfer had cleared at 1:15 in the morning. $34,000. Gone. I did not panic. Panic ruins the chain of evidence. I pressed my knuckles against the cold edge of the desk. My cell phone vibrated on the wood. The caller ID showed Mr. Sterling, the manager of my local bank branch. I answered on the second ring. "Good morning, Euphemia." His voice was measured, lacking his usual corporate warmth. "We have a severe anomaly on your profile." I stared at the zero on my screen. "My money is gone," I said. "It is worse than a withdrawal," Sterling replied. "Someone authorized a $50,000 collateral loan against your credit overnight. I think you need to come in. You need to see the liability agreement they signed." The drive to downtown Albuquerque felt like moving underwater. The windshield wipers dragged back and forth. My grip on the steering wheel turned my knuckles white. As a financial compliance officer, my career depended on a pristine personal background. A sudden, massive debt could flag my security clearance. If this loan defaulted, I would not just lose my savings, I would lose my job. 20 minutes later, I walked into the sterile air conditioning of the downtown bank branch. Sterling sat behind his mahogany desk. He did not offer coffee. He turned his tablet toward me. A DocuSign agreement glowed on the screen. The loan leveraged my decade of flawless credit. At the bottom sat an electronic signature, Euphemia Taylor. The loop of the E and the cross of the T mimicked my handwriting, but the digital pen stroke dragged in the wrong places. It was a traced imitation. "How did they bypass the two-factor authentication?" I asked. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. Sterling tapped the screen. "They bypassed the primary text prompt by routing the security pin to your secondary recovery email." He highlighted a line of text. It was an old family email address I used in high school in Santa Fe. I had forgotten to scrub it from the legacy account settings. "We flagged it for manual review because the origination pinged a location discrepancy," Sterling said. He swiped to the final page of the audit log. A string of numbers sat beside a geolocation tag. It did not trace to a hacker in a foreign country. It did not ping a burner phone. "The IP address resolves to a residential router," Sterling said quietly. "Santa Fe, the Monte Sereno subdivision." My breath caught in my throat. I knew the subdivision. I knew the street. It was the gated community where my parents, Richard and Helen Taylor, had lived for 2 decades. My father always dragged his pen on the cross-stroke of his T's. My parents had not just emptied my life savings, they had forged my identity. "Do you want me to initiate the federal fraud protocol?" Sterling asked. He watched my face carefully. Once I file this, the investigation leaves my branch. It goes to the authorities. I picked up the tablet. The glare of the screen reflected in the dark wood of his desk. A hot, sharp pressure built behind my ribs. I shoved it down. The daughter in me wanted to scream. The compliance officer in me needed facts. "Print these logs for me, Mr. Sterling," I said. I stood up and smoothed the front of my blazer. "I need to make a visit." The drive up Interstate 25 offered a stark transition from the concrete grid of Albuquerque to the sprawling, manicured foothills of Santa Fe. I kept the speedometer locked at exactly 65. I did not turn on the radio. The silence inside the sedan allowed me to compartmentalize the betrayal into manageable data points. Richard and Helen Taylor cultivated their lives like curators at a high-end museum. My father owned a boutique architectural consulting firm, though we spent more time networking on golf courses than reviewing blueprints. My mother served on 3 charity boards. They traded in favors, optics, and country club prestige. Growing up, their affection felt transactional. If I achieved high honors, I earned a seat at the dinner table. If I challenged their narrative, I became invisible. That was why I built my world elsewhere. I chose financial compliance because numbers lack ego. Math does not lie. Math does not twist the truth over Sunday dinner. Now, a manila folder sat on my passenger seat, containing a stack of IP logs that proved my parents viewed my identity as a convenient slush fund. I pulled up to the wrought iron gates of the Monte Sereno subdivision. The security guard recognized my car and waved me through with a polite nod. Their driveway was paved with custom imported stone. I parked behind Richard's pristine silver sports sedan. The vehicle alone cost more than the travel fund they had just drained from my accounts. The front door was unlocked, a testament to the assumed safety of their gated reality. I walked into the foyer. The house smelled of expensive cedar and citrus polish. Vaulted ceilings echoed my footsteps. Framed abstract art hung on pristine white walls, projecting an aura of sophisticated stability. I bypassed the formal living room and headed straight for the rear terrace. The sliding glass doors stood open to the crisp afternoon air. They sat at a wrought iron patio table under a canvas umbrella. Helen wore a cashmere wrap over her shoulders. Richard rested his ankle on his opposite knee. They were sipping Pinot Noir from crystal glasses. Neither of them looked like criminals. They looked like an advertisement for early retirement. I stepped onto the terrace. The ice clinked in my father's glass as he set it down. Helen offered a practiced, camera-ready smile. She did not ask why I was visiting on a Tuesday afternoon. I did not offer a greeting. I dropped the manila folder onto the center of the patio table. The thick stack of printed audit logs slid out, fanning across the glass surface. I tapped the top page directly over the DocuSign timestamp. I kept my voice flat, stripping away any daughterly inflection. "Someone accessed my legacy savings account at 1:15 yesterday morning," I said. "They emptied the balance. Then they bypassed my security protocols, forged my signature, and chained my name to a $50,000 collateral loan. The digital footprint traces to the router sitting in your home office." I watched their faces. A normal person, confronted with federal wire fraud, would exhibit shock. A guilty person would show fear. Richard and Helen showed neither. My father simply lowered his foot to the deck. He reached for the cuff of his expensive linen shirt, meticulous and slow, adjusting the button with a steady hand. He acted as though I had pointed out a scuff on his shoe, rather than a felony. Helen leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. Her smile remained, but it hardened at the edges. She picked up her wineglass and swirled the dark liquid. "It is just a temporary bridge loan, Euphemia," she said. Her tone suggested I had complained about a missed dinner reservation, not a stolen identity. "Your father encountered a sudden complication. We were hit with a devastating IRS audit. They demanded immediate restitution or they would freeze his business accounts. We needed liquid capital overnight to keep the firm operational." Richard nodded, picking up the thread. "We knew you had that travel fund sitting idle," he added. "Family steps in when things get dire. We will replace the funds in 30 days. You will not lose a single cent." It was a calculated pivot. The classic red herring. They expected the mention of the IRS to intimidate me, to shift the narrative from their crime to their supposed victimization. They framed my arrival as a hysterical overreaction to a simple family favor. They wanted me to feel guilty for demanding accountability while my father faced financial ruin. My compliance instincts flared cold and bright. The lie was sloppy. The Internal Revenue Service does not operate like a cartel. They do not demand $50,000 overnight. A federal tax audit follows a rigid, undeniable timeline. They issue a notice of examination. They send certified letters detailing proposed adjustments. If a balance is owed, they issue a Form C P504 stating an intent to levy, offering structured payment plans. The entire process takes months. They certainly do not force citizens to forge electronic signatures on high-interest bank loans at 2 a.m. To believe their story meant ignoring every protocol I audited for a living. "You stole my money," I said. "You committed identity theft." Helen sighed, pressing a hand to her chest. "Steal is an ugly word for borrowing. We gave you everything. We paid for your upbringing. You are acting incredibly selfish over a minor administrative shuffle." I looked at the imported stone beneath my feet. I looked at the silver sports sedan in the driveway. A minor administrative shuffle does not require a forged power of attorney. I looked back at Richard. His relaxed posture began to stiffen under my scrutiny. He was accustomed to deference, not audits. "If the IRS is auditing your firm," I said, "show me the official notification letter. Show me the federal demand for immediate payment. Show me the auditor's contact information. I deal with federal regulators every day. I can help you navigate the settlement. Hand me the file." The warm maternal mask evaporated. Helen set her wine glass down hard enough to risk shattering the crystal. Her features tightened into a cold, defensive scowl. "You do not interrogate us in our own home," she snapped. "We do not owe you paperwork. You owe us respect." Richard leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. He let his wife handle the execution. He watched me with eyes that offered no apology, only irritation that his pristine afternoon had been interrupted. Helen stood up. She smoothed her cashmere wrap and looked down at me with eyes that held zero warmth. "You need to leave," she said. Her voice dropped to a quiet, serrated edge. "We are handling a crisis. We do not have the patience for your dramatics. And if you decide to make a mess out of this, if you go back to that bank and file a police report against your own parents, understand the consequences." She took a step closer, invading my physical space. "We sit on the boards of 3 financial institutions in this state. We play golf with the regional directors. We dine with the partners at your logistics firm. If you turn this bridge loan into a public scandal, I will personally call your department head. I will tell them you are unstable. I will tell them you are suffering from a psychological break. We will ensure your professional reputation in New Mexico is ruined before the month is over. You will never work in compliance again." The drive back to Albuquerque offered no catharsis. The highway stretched ahead, a ribbon of dark asphalt cutting through the high desert. I kept my phone muted on the passenger seat. My mother had promised ruin, and Helen Taylor never made empty threats. She operated with the precision of a seasoned politician. If she felt cornered, she went on the offensive. I expected a legal letter. I expected a demand for formal mediation. I underestimated her willingness to burn my reputation in a public square. The assault began before sunrise the next morning. My phone vibrated against the nightstand, a relentless mechanical buzz that rattled the wood. I picked it up, squinting against the harsh glare of the screen. The lock interface was choked with notifications. 32 unread text messages, 47 alerts from various social platforms. I unlocked the device, my heart maintaining a steady clinical rhythm. The digital warfare was meticulously curated. Helen had not called me a thief. That would be actionable in civil court. Instead, she painted a masterpiece of victimhood. She posted a photograph from 3 Thanksgivings ago. In the image, Richard looked tired, rubbing his temples, while I sat in the background looking at my phone. The lighting cast shadows under my father's eyes. The caption was a masterclass in character assassination. It read, "Sometimes the hardest trials come from the ones you sacrificed everything to raise." Richard is facing a temporary hurdle with his firm, a simple tax misunderstanding. We asked for a brief, minor lifeline. We were met with cold refusal. It breaks a mother's heart to see a daughter prioritize soccer tickets to Spain over her own father's livelihood. Praying for healing. She hit every demographic trigger. She framed me as a selfish, sports-obsessed spinster. She framed Richard as a weary, hard-working patriarch. She framed my stolen life savings as a minor lifeline I had heartlessly denied them. The extended family fell into line immediately. The Taylors functioned like a feudal court. Richard controlled the inheritance, the country club memberships, and the lucrative networking introductions. Disloyalty meant exile. My inbox flooded with venom. A cousin in Denver texted me to ask how I slept at night. A second cousin sent a lengthy paragraph about the biblical honoring of parents. Then came the comment from Aunt Patricia. Patricia was Helen's sister, a woman whose entire personality revolved around her zip code and her tennis backhand. Beneath Helen's post, Patricia left a stinging public remark. Richard is a pillar of resilience. It is a tragedy when a child chooses a European vacation over family duty. An ungrateful child is a heavy cross to bear. Patricia tagged my personal account in the comment. She wanted her affluent peers to see my name attached to the disgrace. The weaponization of public perception was designed to isolate me. They wanted to paralyze me with shame until I dropped my demands and accepted the forgery in silence. I showered in scalding water, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, and drove to the logistics firm. My office was a sanctuary of glass and steel. In the corporate compliance department, optics were just as vital as mathematics. We audited multinational shipping contracts. We possessed high-level security clearances. Any sign of personal financial distress or public instability triggered an internal review. If an employee showed vulnerability to blackmail, their access was instantly revoked. I poured a cup of black coffee in the break room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow. My colleague Marcus leaned against the granite counter. He was a senior risk analyst, a man who noticed everything from misplaced decimal points to subtle shifts in office politics. He stirred his tea, keeping his eyes fixed on the ceramic mug. "Rough morning on the timeline, Euphemia," Marcus said quietly. I froze. My coffee cup hovered inches from my mouth. "My wife follows your mother on that photo-sharing application," Marcus continued, his voice neutral. "She showed me the post over breakfast. I do not pry into personal matters. But Human Resources monitors social sentiment for everyone in our department. If a narrative gains traction about you refusing to aid a family financial crisis, it paints a picture of fiscal instability. They might question your security clearance." He took a sip of his tea and walked out of the break room. He did not ask if the post was true. He simply warned me that the fallout was bleeding into my professional sanctuary. Helen's threat from the terrace was materializing. She was not just attacking my character, she was actively dismantling my livelihood. I returned to my desk and closed the heavy glass door. The click of the latch echoed in the quiet room. A lesser person would have retaliated. I could have drafted a scathing response. I could have posted the DocuSign forgery for her country club friends to see. I could have screamed my innocence into the digital void. I did none of those things. Screaming on the internet never recovers stolen funds. Arguing with a narcissist only provides them with the oxygen they crave. I logged out of all my social accounts. I put my phone on airplane mode. I engaged a silent, impenetrable defense. I spent my lunch hour utilizing my dual monitors to build an airtight physical ledger. I printed the login timestamps from my bank. I printed the geolocations of the IP addresses. I printed the secondary email routing confirmation. I aligned the pages perfectly, slid them into protective sleeves, and snapped them into a heavy black binder. Let Helen have the comments section. I possessed the federal wire fraud evidence. The digital shouting match meant nothing against the weight of a felony record. I left the office well after sunset. The Albuquerque skyline glowed against the dark outline of the Sandia Mountains. I drove back to my apartment, locked the deadbolt, and dropped my keys onto the granite kitchen counter. The silence of my living room felt heavier than usual. The isolation Helen engineered was working. I felt cut off, standing alone against a family that possessed limitless resources and zero moral boundaries. I poured a glass of ice water and sat on my leather couch. I switched my phone off airplane mode to check for any official banking updates from Mr. Sterling. A flurry of delayed notifications cascaded down the screen. I ignored the hateful texts from cousins. I ignored the missed calls from Patricia. At exactly 11:42 at night, the phone vibrated with a sharp, distinct pulse. It was a message sent through an encrypted end-to-end secure application. The sender, ID, was a string of random numbers. I opened the application. The screen displayed a single geographic coordinate mapping to an obscure 24-hour diner on the outskirts of the city. Below the coordinate sat a brief line of text. Helen is lying. Meet me at dawn. The message signed off with a name I had not spoken in 5 years. Aunt Kiara. Kiara was Richard's estranged sister. As an African-American woman adopted into the Taylor family decades ago, she had always existed on the periphery of their pristine facade. Kiara possessed a sharp intellect and an intolerance for deceit. She saw through Richard's posturing and Helen's manipulations long before I did. 5 years ago, a bitter argument over a trust allocation had resulted in her excommunication from the Taylor circle. My parents forbade anyone from contacting her. I had adhered to that silent ban out of cowardly convenience. Now her name glared at me from the glowing screen. She was reaching across a chasm of silence, holding a lantern in the dark. The bruised purple sky of dawn hung over the Sandia Mountains as I parked my sedan in the cracked asphalt lot. The diner sat on a deserted stretch of the frontage road. A flickering neon sign buzzed against the quiet morning. It was a cinder block building that smelled of old grease and stale coffee. This was not a place Richard or Helen Taylor would ever step foot inside. That was precisely why Aunt Kiara chose it. I pushed through the heavy glass door. The bell above chimed a dull note. The interior featured faded vinyl booths and scarred formica tables. A lone waitress wiped down the counter. Sitting in the back corner booth facing the entrance was Kiara. She wore a tailored camel trench coat over a crisp white blouse. Her dark hair was pulled into a sleek, severe knot. Even in a dilapidated roadside diner at 5 a.m, Kiara commanded the space. She was a striking African-American woman adopted into the Taylor family during the late 70s. Growing up, she was the only relative who offered me a genuine smile instead of a critique. She possessed a sharp, analytical mind that refused to bend to Richard's ego or Helen's vanity. 5 years ago, she called out a glaring discrepancy in a family real estate deal. Richard demanded an apology. Kiara packed her bags and severed ties. I had missed her clarity every day since, though cowardly convenience had kept me silent. I slid into the booth across from her. The vinyl groaned under my weight. "You look tired, Euphemia," Kiara said. Her voice carried a rich, resonant timbre. It held no accusation, only a steady observation of fact. I ordered a black coffee from the approaching waitress. I waited until the ceramic mug was placed between us before speaking. "They orchestrated a smear campaign against me yesterday," I said, keeping my tone level. Helen posted photos. Patricia tagged my accounts. "They are trying to ruin my professional reputation to force my silence." Kiara took a slow sip of her tea. "I saw the post," she replied. Helen always fights dirty when she is hiding something fragile. "You did the right thing by ignoring the bait. Engaging with a narcissist in a public forum only feeds their narrative. Tell me what they actually did." I laid out the timeline with forensic precision. I detailed the zero balance in my legacy savings account. I explained the DocuSign forgery that bypassed two-factor authentication and the $50,000 shadow debt now shackled to my credit profile. I explained my confrontation on their pristine terrace in Santa Fe. They claimed Richard was hit with a surprise IRS audit, I said. They told me the federal government was threatening to freeze his business accounts. They framed the forgery as a temporary bridge loan to save the firm. Kiara lowered her teacup. A sharp, rhythmic sound broke the silence of our booth. Tap, tap, tap. Her manicured acrylic nails struck the side of her ceramic mug. It was a metronome of suppressed frustration, a physical manifestation of her lifelong exhaustion with her brother's entitlement. A humorless smile touched the corners of her mouth. "Richard is lying," Kiara stated. "The lie is sloppy." "I know the timeline makes no sense," I replied. "The IRS does not demand immediate overnight capital." "It is not just the timeline," Kiara said, her dark eyes locked onto mine. "Richard uses a boutique accounting firm in Scottsdale. His lead accountant is a man named Harrison. Harrison is terrified of federal regulators. He audits Richard's books triple time before submitting a single tax schedule. Richard has not triggered an IRS red flag in 20 years. His firm operates with a pristine tax shield. There is no audit. There are no frozen accounts. Your father did not steal your World Cup fund to pay the government." The diner grew silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator compressors. I processed the data. If Richard was solvent, the forgery made even less sense. They risked federal prison. They risked my entire career. People do not commit identity theft for sport. They do it out of desperate, suffocating necessity. If Richard does not need the capital, I asked, where did $84,000 go? Kiara stopped tapping her nails against the mug. She folded her hands on the Formica table. "The financial black hole in this family is not your father," she said softly. "It is your brother." The name David hung in the air between us. My older brother David was the undisputed golden child of the Taylor dynasty. He possessed Richard's charismatic smile and Helen's talent for optics. While I retreated into textbooks and corporate compliance, David thrived in the country club social scene. He wore bespoke suits. He drove imported luxury SUVs. He branded himself as a visionary real estate entrepreneur. At family dinners, Richard would toast to David's latest acquisition or his upcoming commercial developments. David was the heir apparent, the successful son paraded before the Santa Fe elite. "David is thriving," I countered my mind, struggling to reconcile the data. "He just closed a syndicate deal in Denver last quarter. Helen talks about his portfolio every week." Kiara offered a look of profound pity. "You hunt corporate fraud for a living, Euphemia. You know better than anyone that a lifestyle is not a balance sheet. David is a ghost. He owns nothing." She leaned forward, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial hush. "The real estate empire is a mirage. David possesses zero liquid capital. He operates entirely on predatory leased credit. Every time one of his shell companies edges toward bankruptcy, Richard and Helen step in. They quietly liquidate their own resources to cover his margins. They pay his overdue subprime auto loans. They cover the shortfalls on his speculative investments. They have spent a decade bailing him out to protect the illusion of his success. If Santa Fe society discovered their golden son was a financial failure, it would destroy Helen's vanity." My chest tightened. The air conditioning vent above our booth blew a steady stream of cold air against my neck. I pieced the fractured logic together. My parents had siphoned my hard-earned savings. They had forged my signature. They had jeopardized my security clearance. They did not do it to save the family patriarch. They did it to cover the gambling debts of a spoiled, incompetent son. "Why now?" I asked. "Why steal my identity this week? They have always managed to bail him out before." "Because David escalated his game," Kiara explained. "He stepped out of his usual minor leagues. He got involved in a speculative commercial flip that required heavy, immediate cash. Richard and Helen were tapped out of their liquid checking accounts. They needed $84,000 fast. You were the only available target with a pristine credit score." The sheer entitlement of the act threatened to paralyze me. My parents viewed me not as a daughter, but as a collateral asset, a disposable resource to shield David from his own incompetence. "I need proof," I said. "I cannot take a bank manager a story about my brother's bad business habits. I need a paper trail linking my stolen funds to David's accounts." Kiara reached into the pocket of her trench coat. She withdrew a small, folded paper napkin. She placed it on the table and slid it across the scarred formica until it rested near my coffee mug. I unfolded the thin paper. Written in crisp black ink was a 9-digit number. "That is the employer identification number for David's primary holding company," Kiara whispered. I stared at the sequence of digits. In my line of work, an EIN was a skeleton key. It unlocked federal tax liens, commercial property registries, and corporate bankruptcy filings. With that number, I could strip away the bespoke suits and the imported cars. I could drag David's raw, unedited financial reality into the light. "Run his numbers, Euphemia," Kiara said. Her voice held the solemn weight of a judge delivering a sentence. "Follow the wire transfers. Follow the routing numbers. He did not just borrow your money, he buried it." I left the diner as the morning sun crested the jagged peaks of the Sandia Mountains. The early light offered no warmth. I drove back to my apartment complex in silence, keeping the radio off. The crumpled paper napkin rested on the passenger seat. The 9-digit employer identification number, written in Aunt Kiara's crisp handwriting, felt like a loaded weapon. My mind categorized the new data points. My parents did not orchestrate a massive forgery out of an unexpected tax panic. They executed a targeted strike on my identity to cover a different kind of deficit. I unlocked the deadbolt to my apartment. My living space reflected my profession. It was orderly, minimalist, and clean. I walked straight into my home office and sat in the ergonomic chair. I pressed the power button on my workstation. The dual monitors flared to life, casting a cool blue glow across the dark desk. I smoothed the paper napkin flat against the glass surface. Growing up, David was the undisputed heir to the Taylor dynasty. He was 4 years older than me and possessed my father's charismatic smile. He absorbed my mother's talent for optics. When David turned 25, Richard handed him a seed capital check over a catered dinner at the country club. Helen raised a glass of champagne and praised his innate business ambition. He had graduated with a mediocre business degree, yet my parents treated him like a Wall Street prodigy. While I worked 60-hour weeks analyzing shipping manifests to earn my compliance credentials, David attended charity galas. He played golf with regional directors. He sold an image of effortless prosperity. I always assumed the image held at least a fraction of genuine substance. I opened the state commercial registry database. In the corporate compliance sector, an EIN operates as a digital fingerprint. A business owner cannot hide from it. It links every tax lien, every credit application, and every registered asset back to the central host. I typed the 9 digits into the search bar and pressed enter. The screen populated with a labyrinth of corporate filings. David did not own a single unified business. He managed a tangled web of shell companies. He utilized nested entities hiding limited liability companies inside other limited liability companies. It was a classic obfuscation tactic. People structure their businesses this way when they are trying to outrun creditors and confuse auditors. I navigated to the Uniform Commercial Code portal. A UCC filing is a legal notice a lender places on the public record to declare a security interest in a debtor's assets. If a business owner possesses their equipment outright, their registry remains clean. If they owe capital, the portal lights up with claims. David's registry read like a distress signal. Dozens of active liens populated my monitor. Vendors filed claims for unpaid construction materials. Private lenders secured interests against future unrealized revenue. State tax agencies posted warrants for unremitted payroll taxes. David operated in a constant, suffocating state of deficit. I needed a visual comparison. I opened a new browser tab and navigated to his public social media profile. I had to measure the distance between his synthetic presentation and his brutal financial reality. The most recent photograph loaded on the screen. David wore a tailored charcoal suit. He was casually leaning against a sleek imported sports car in the valet circle of an upscale hotel. The caption read that hard work pays off and vision always wins. I leaned closer to the monitor. The license plate of the sports car was visible in the high-resolution image. I memorized the alphanumeric sequence. I switched back to the commercial database and cross-referenced the plate number with the state motor vehicle registry linked to his primary corporate entity. The search algorithm churned for 3 seconds before returning a financing contract. David did not own the luxury car. He did not even possess a standard bank loan. The vehicle was tied to a predatory subprime lease agreement featuring a staggering interest rate. He did not own the tires. He did not own the engine. He rented the aesthetic of wealth on a month-to-month basis, bleeding capital just to look the part of a successful entrepreneur. This was the pebble that cracked the entire windshield. The illusion shattered in real time. I utilized a secure terminal access point that aggregated commercial risk scores to dive deeper into his credit utilization. The data painted a picture of a man in free fall. His corporate credit cards carried maximum balances. His revolving lines of credit sat in default status. His liquid assets amounted to 0. He possessed no cash reserves and no equity in any of his properties. My chest felt hollow as the true weight of the betrayal settled over me. This realization shifted the entire foundation of the conflict. My parents did not steal my World Cup travel fund to help David bridge a temporary gap between lucrative real estate deals. They did not forge my electronic signature to protect a thriving empire from a minor cash flow interruption. They committed federal identity theft to perform CPR on a financial corpse. Helen and Richard knew David was broke. They actively participated in the lie. They sacrificed my future, my savings, and my professional security to delay the inevitable public humiliation of their favorite child. They preferred to see me face a catastrophic default rather than admit to their country club peers that their golden son was a failure. The theft was not a panicked mistake. It was an act of calculated malice designed to keep his synthetic house of cards standing for one more month. I stared at the glowing numbers on the screen. The anger in my blood turned to ice. A meticulous mind recognizes patterns, and a stark anomaly remained buried in the ledger. $84,000. The stolen sum consisted of my $34,000 cash balance combined with the $50,000 collateral loan. If David simply needed to maintain his facade, he would use the funds piecemeal. He would pay $3,000 toward the subprime sports car lease. He would wire $10,000 to appease a restless vendor holding a mechanic's lien. General debt maintenance is a scattershot process involving multiple small transactions. But the bank ledger showed a singular, precise extraction. My parents calculated the exact maximum limit they could drain and borrow against my profile. They did not siphon the money to pay down existing credit cards. They required a specific lump sum. I opened the encrypted file Mr. Sterling provided at the bank. The file contained the raw transaction logs and the shadow loan disbursement details. The bank had approved the collateral loan, deposited the funds into my compromised legacy account, and then instantly executed an outgoing wire transfer for the combined total. I needed to know where the money went. I pulled the outgoing wire receipt from the downloaded statement. The metadata held the domestic clearinghouse details. I traced the routing sequence, identifying the receiving institution and the beneficiary account name. The screen refreshed. A new corporate entity appeared on my monitor. The $84,000 did not go to the Internal Revenue Service. It did not go to David's aggressive creditors. The wire transfer cleared exactly 7 days ago. The destination routing number belonged to an obscure commercial development firm. The firm was registered to a small business park located in Taos, New Mexico. The money was not used to pay off past mistakes. It was funneled directly into a brand new speculative venture hidden deep in the northern mountains. I picked up my phone and opened the encrypted messaging application. The digital trail confirmed the destination of the stolen funds, but a compliance officer requires physical documentation. Wire logs prove money moved. Contracts prove intent. I dialed the secure number Aunt Kiara provided earlier that morning. She answered on the second ring. I explained the routing data I uncovered. I told her the exact sum of $84,000 went to an obscure commercial development firm in Taos, New Mexico. I needed the contractual mechanism linking my brother to that entity. Kiara possessed a unique advantage. She maintained a quiet network of former receptionists and administrative assistants who despised David. He treated his support staff with profound arrogance. That kind of behavior breeds silent enemies. Kiara told me to stay in my apartment and wait. The hours stretched tight. I paced the hardwood floor of my living room. Outside, the New Mexico sun baked the asphalt of the parking lot. At 2 p.m, my intercom buzzed. I pressed the release button. Heavy footsteps echoed in the stairwell. Kiara appeared at my door wearing dark sunglasses and a structured wool blazer. She bypassed the pleasantries and walked straight into my home office. She carried a thick brown envelope. She dropped it onto my glass desk with a heavy thud. David treats his workspace like a college dormitory, she said, removing her sunglasses. He leaves sensitive mail sitting on his assistant's desk for days. One of my old contacts intercepted this package before he bothered to open it. Consider it a permanent acquisition. I sat down and unfastened the metal clasp. A dense stack of legal paper slid out onto the glass. It was a commercial real estate contract. The header declared an exclusive high-yield property flip located in the northern mountains. The target was a dilapidated commercial lodge slated for luxury renovation. Beneath the dense legal text sat a promotional brochure. I pulled it out and studied the material. The contrast offended my professional sensibilities. It was printed on cheap, thin paper. The ink rubbed off slightly against the pad of my thumb. The cover featured a picture of a snow-covered peak with a rustic cabin in the foreground. It was a generic downloaded stock image. I could still see the faint translucent watermark of the original photography agency hovering over the pine trees. The typography was misaligned. The margins were uneven. It was an insult to basic due diligence. My parents stole a fortune and funneled it into a project advertised with uncredited internet photos. Kiara leaned against the doorframe and watched me process the documents. David cornered Richard and Helen last month, she explained. His creditors were circling. The subprime lenders threatened imminent repossession of his vehicles. Instead of admitting defeat, he pitched a fantasy. He framed this Taos flip as his ultimate masterpiece. He told them the return on investment would erase every hidden debt he had accumulated over the past 10 years. He promised them permanent freedom from his financial burden. My parents were desperate for an exit strategy. They wanted to close the chapter on his failures and secure his country club reputation forever. They bought the delusion because the alternative meant facing public reality, but they lacked the liquid cash to buy his entry ticket. David needed a silent partner. They selected me. I was the involuntary angel investor dragged into a sinking ship. I stared at the signature line on the final page of the contract. David had executed the agreement as the primary capital contributor. The gravity of the situation shifted, altering the entire landscape of my recovery effort. The stolen funds were no longer sitting in a digital holding account. They were not resting in a checking balance, waiting for a simple bank reversal. The money was locked into a speculative, illiquid asset. Buying distressed real estate requires moving cash into escrow accounts, paying concrete retainers, and funding architectural surveys. You cannot simply call a bank and ask for a refund on a finalized property deed. Recovering capital from a signed commercial contract demands years of complex civil litigation. My life savings were buried under dirt and legal fees in Taos. I pushed the cheap brochure aside. I needed to understand the entity holding my stolen future. I highlighted the name of the primary developer, printed on the vendor agreement. It was an individual operating under a nested corporate structure. I turned to my workstation. I booted my specialized compliance terminal. My logistics firm provided senior officers with remote access to encrypted federal databases. We used these portals to vet international shipping partners and detect global money laundering operations. The system linked directly to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network and the Securities and Exchange Commission. I established the secure connection. The interface required secondary biometric authentication. I placed my thumb against the optical reader. The screen flashed a brilliant green, granting access to the restricted federal servers. I navigated to the Civil and Criminal Registry portal. I typed the developer's name into the query field along with his primary business identification number extracted from the contract. I expected to find a history of local bankruptcies. I expected a trail of poor credit ratings or a sleazy businessman running a minor regional hustle. The search algorithm took longer than usual to process the request. The progress bar stalled at 90%. The cooling fan inside my computer accelerated whining against the heavy processing load. When the page finally rendered, the standard white background of the database vanished. The screen inverted colors. A solid crimson banner materialized across the top of my dual monitors. In the compliance sector, a red banner indicates a severe regulatory alert. It signifies an entity actively monitored and restricted by federal authorities. I scrolled down through the restricted dossier. The developer was not just a risky real estate promoter. He was the architect of a sophisticated interstate fraud syndicate. The Securities and Exchange Commission had recently placed his primary holding company under a sealed federal indictment. He was operating a Ponzi scheme. He targeted desperate investors using fabricated property deeds and stock photos as collateral. The air in my office turned frigid. My stolen travel fund and the shadow loan attached to my identity were not just lost in a foolish investment. They were chained directly to an active criminal enterprise. My parents had handed my pristine credit and my financial future to a federal target. The crimson banner on the federal database illuminated my home office in a harsh, glaring light. A sealed Securities and Exchange Commission indictment meant the federal government had already gathered sufficient evidence to dismantle the operation. In the compliance sector, we study the architecture of financial fraud. A Ponzi scheme relies on a continuous influx of fresh capital to pay off early adopters, creating a synthetic illusion of profit. It is a parasitic organism that consumes until the host population runs dry. The Taoist developer was not building luxury mountain resorts. He was running a sophisticated disposal unit for stolen money. My $84,000 represented fresh blood pumped into a dying system. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair. The cooling fan of my workstation hummed against the silence of the apartment. A disturbing friction emerged in my analysis. The data did not align with the psychological profile of the target. David possessed an ego that required constant validation. He attended expensive real estate seminars. He boasted at country club dinners about outsmarting regional markets. He viewed himself as an apex predator in the commercial sector. A man with that level of arrogance does not easily fall victim to a generic stock photo brochure printed on cheap paper. An auditor learns to look for the deviation in the pattern. When the narrative contradicts the behavior, the truth usually hides in the margins. I turned my attention back to the thick brown envelope Aunt Kiara had delivered. I pulled the dense stack of legal addendums toward me. The commercial contract featured multiple appendices detailing vendor agreements and liability waivers. Tucked behind a schedule of assets, I found a secondary packet of printed correspondence. David routinely required his assistant to print his email chains for physical archiving. It was an antiquated habit born from a desire to look important while holding a physical ledger. I began reading the printed communications between David and the Taos developer. The tone of the emails felt entirely wrong. David usually wrote with aggressive, enthusiastic buzzwords. He loved phrases like synergistic growth and paradigm-shifting returns. These emails lacked any of that synthetic charm. The language was sterile, hurried, and cynical. He did not ask questions about zoning permits or architectural renderings. He only asked about the speed of wire transfers and the structure of the liability shield. I flipped to the next page. A different email chain appeared, secured by a single, heavy staple. The recipient address did not belong to the Taos developer. The domain name traced to a prominent law firm located in downtown Albuquerque. I recognized the firm. They specialized in aggressive corporate restructuring and complex asset liquidation. They were bankruptcy attorneys. I smoothed the wrinkled paper against the glass surface of my desk. I read the text of the message. David wrote that his primary holding company was facing an unsustainable debt ratio. He explicitly mentioned the Taos venture by name. He stated that the mountain development project was highly unstable and facing imminent federal receivership. He asked the senior partner to confirm a specific legal strategy. He wanted written assurance that once the Taos entity collapsed under federal scrutiny, his attached corporate liabilities would be eligible for a clean discharge under Chapter 7 bankruptcy rules. I stared at the black ink. The words blurred for a fraction of a second as the sheer scale of the betrayal struck my chest. David was not a naive victim duped by a smooth-talking fraudster. He recognized the Ponzi scheme for exactly what it was. He saw a financial black hole and decided to use it as a graveyard. I looked at the top right corner of the printed page. A standard metadata string displayed the exact date and time the email was routed through the server. October 14th at 4 in the afternoon. I opened the encrypted file Mr. Sterling provided at the bank. I pulled up the security logs detailing the shadow loan origination. Richard forged my electronic signature on the DocuSign agreement on October 17th at 2 in the morning. The email to the bankruptcy attorney was drafted and sent 3 days before my father logged into the home router to steal my identity. The chronology outlined a premeditated execution. My brother engineered my financial ruin to buy his own freedom. David knew his synthetic real estate empire was days away from a catastrophic implosion. His subprime lenders were preparing to seize his vehicles. His vendors were filing liens. He needed a way to wipe the slate clean without dragging his personal assets into the fire. If he borrowed money directly from Richard and Helen, the inevitable default would destroy his parents' retirement and end his reign as the golden child. He needed a sacrificial lamb. He targeted me. He convinced our parents to forge my signature and leverage my pristine credit score. He took my $34,000 cash savings and the $50,000 bank loan. He funneled the combined total straight into a confirmed federal Ponzi scheme. He orchestrated the transaction knowing the Securities and Exchange Commission would freeze the Taos accounts. Once the government seized the fraudulent development, David planned to file for corporate bankruptcy. He would present the Taos contract to a judge and claim he was the tragic victim of a scam. The courts would discharge his debts. He would walk away clean, his hands washed of the failure. But I would be left holding a $50,000 anchor. Because my name sat on the bank loan, not his. David designed a financial guillotine, handed Richard the rope, and watched them drop the blade on my neck. A cold, absolute clarity washed over me. The anger vanished, replaced by a rigid, methodical focus. This was no longer a dispute over a stolen travel fund. This was a calculated conspiracy to destroy my livelihood. My parents were complicit enablers, but my brother was the architect. I gathered the printed emails, the DocuSign logs, and the federal indictment records. I aligned the edges of the paper, forming a pristine, structured dossier. I slid the documents into my leather briefcase. Mr. Sterling needed to see the premeditation. The federal fraud protocol was no longer an intimidating threat. It was the only weapon I possessed to sever the chains they had wrapped around my identity. I stood up and grabbed my car keys from the granite counter. I walked toward the front door of my apartment, preparing my statement for the bank manager. My smartphone vibrated in my pocket. It was not a standard text message alert. The phone emitted a sustained, jarring rhythm designed to cut through ambient noise. I pulled the device from my jacket. The screen glowed with a high-priority notification from my banking application. A red warning icon flashed across the digital interface. The federal freeze on the Taos holding company had cascaded through the banking network faster than I anticipated. Financial institutions utilize automated risk algorithms to detect associations with indicted entities. The system traced the destination of my outgoing wire transfer. The algorithm flagged the connection between my newly issued collateral loan and the seized Ponzi assets. The bank deployed an automatic protective countermeasure. I read the text of the notification. The glowing letters informed me that, due to critical risk factors associated with the loan disbursement, my account was officially locked. The system demanded immediate restitution of the compromised funds. The alert pushed my profile into official default status. The red warning icon on the banking application did not just signify a frozen account. In the financial compliance industry, an automated default triggers a cascading systemic alert. Financial institutions share risk data across secure networks. If an individual holding a high-level corporate clearance defaults on a $50,000 loan, the algorithm flags them as a severe liability. I stared at the screen of my personal device. The digital numbers felt heavy. Before I could process the mechanics of the freeze, my secondary device vibrated in my pocket. I pulled out my corporate smartphone. A notification banner slid across the glass. The sender was Director Sullivan, the head of the risk management division at my logistics firm. The subject line read, "Urgent Review of Status." I opened the message. The text was brief and sterile. Human Resources had just received an automated credit anomaly flag regarding my profile. My security clearance required an uncompromised financial background. An active default status suggested I was vulnerable to bribery or corporate espionage. The email instructed me to surrender my corporate access badge pending a mandatory review board hearing on Friday morning. I was placed on immediate administrative leave. A damp chill broke across my skin. Cold sweat pooled in the palms of my hands. I wiped them against the fabric of my charcoal trousers. 10 years of meticulous career building were evaporating in front of my eyes. I spent a decade navigating corporate hierarchies, earning certifications, and maintaining a flawless record to escape the shadow of my family. I built a sanctuary of logic and mathematics. Now the shadow was dragging me under. If the board revoked my clearance, I would be blacklisted across the entire logistics sector. My livelihood was tethered to a sinking stone. I grabbed my leather briefcase and left my apartment. I drove straight to the downtown bank branch. The midday traffic crawled under the harsh New Mexico sun. I gripped the steering wheel, letting the rigid leather ground my focus. I needed a bureaucratic shield. I needed Mr. Sterling to halt the default. I bypassed the teller line and walked directly into his mahogany office. He stood up when I entered. His face carried a grim understanding. He gestured to the leather chair across from his desk. I sat down and unclasped my briefcase. I slid the structured dossier across the wood. The file contains everything I said. My voice held a sharp, desperate edge. The DocuSign geolocations, the IP logs, the federal indictment records for the Taoist developer, and internal emails proving my brother orchestrated the entire transaction. David knew it was a Ponzi scheme. He engineered the theft to discharge his own debts through bankruptcy. Sterling opened the folder. He reviewed the printed pages in silence. The ticking of his silver desk clock filled the quiet room. He spent several minutes reading the metadata and cross-referencing the dates. When he finally looked up, his expression was a mix of professional respect and deep pity. "This is a flawless forensic package, Euphemia," he stated. "You mapped the entire conspiracy." "Then freeze the default," I replied. "Halt the human resources reporting matrix. Remove the liability from my profile." Sterling closed the folder and folded his hands on top of it. He leaned back in his chair. "The banking system operates on rigid federal algorithms," he explained. "I possess the authority to flag an account for internal review. I do not possess the authority to erase a finalized collateral loan simply because you brought me a compelling dossier. Unspooling a fraud investigation of this magnitude requires multiple jurisdictional approvals. The compliance department must verify the IP logs. The legal team must review the bankruptcy intent. The Securities and Exchange Commission will likely subpoena our records regarding the Taos wire transfer." "How long?" I asked. "Months," he replied. "Perhaps a year. The default status will remain active during the entire investigative process. Your credit score will plummet. Your corporate flags will not be lifted." I stared at the silver clock on his desk. The second hand swept forward in a smooth, continuous motion. Time was a luxury I no longer possessed. My review board hearing was 3 days away. "There must be an immediate override," I said. Sterling sighed. "There is one mechanism to halt the default and instantly freeze the liability," he said, "but it removes the process from civil arbitration and places it directly into the criminal justice system. You must go to the police precinct today. You must formally swear out a criminal complaint for identity theft and federal wire fraud against Richard and Helen Taylor. Once you provide me with an active police report number, the bank is legally required to suspend the debt collection and clear your credit profile pending criminal prosecution." He paused, letting the gravity of the requirement settle over the desk. "Or you pay the $50,000 out of pocket right now to satisfy the ledger," he added softly. "I do not have $50,000, I said. "They stole my liquid reserves." "Then you have to press charges," Sterling said. "You have to send the police to their doorstep." I left the bank and walked to my sedan. The Albuquerque sun beat down on the asphalt, baking the air into a shimmering haze. I unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat. I did not start the engine. The interior grew stifling hot, but I felt nothing but a hollow cold radiating from my chest. I stared at the dashboard. The digital clock read 2:14 in the afternoon. The precinct was 3 miles away. I visualized the sequence of events. I would walk into the station. I would hand the dossier to a detective. Warrants would be drafted. Uniformed officers would drive to the Monte Sereno subdivision. They would walk past the manicured hedges. They would place Richard and Helen in handcuffs on their pristine terrace. The weight of the decision paralyzed my hands. I hunted corporate thieves for a living. I felt no remorse exposing corrupt executives or penalizing greedy contractors. But sending my own flesh and blood to a federal cell required crossing a profound psychological threshold. My parents were vain, entitled, and cruel. They viewed me as a disposable asset. Yet the cultural conditioning of family loyalty ran deep. It was a suffocating tether. If I made the drive to the precinct, I would cross a line that could never be uncrossed. I closed my eyes. The silence of the hot car pressed against my ears. I needed a moment of clarity. I needed the strength to turn the ignition key. My phone shattered the quiet. The sudden sharp ringtone made me flinch. I opened my eyes and looked at the center console. The caller ID displayed my mother's name. I stared at the glowing letters. Less than 48 hours ago, Helen stood on her patio and promised to destroy my reputation. She orchestrated a vicious digital smear campaign designed to isolate me. She encouraged my extended relatives to label me a selfish spinster. She weaponized my silence. I picked up the device. I pressed the green icon and held the speaker to my ear. I did not say hello. Euphemia, darling Helen's voice floated through the receiver. Her tone was sickeningly sweet. It carried the light musical lilt she reserved for charity galas and country club luncheons. It held zero malice. It contained no trace of the venom she spewed during our last encounter. The dissonance was jarring. She spoke as if the past 2 days simply did not exist. I remained silent, listening to her breathe on the other end of the line. "I know tensions were running a bit high the other day," she continued smoothly. "We were all just feeling the pressure of the moment. Family is complicated, isn't it? But we always figure things out. We always come back to the table." "You stole my identity," I said. My voice was a flat, dry rasp. "The bank just defaulted my profile. Human Resources flagged my security clearance. I am losing my job." Helen clicked her tongue, producing a gentle sound of maternal reprimand. "Stop being so dramatic, sweetheart. Nobody is losing their job. We are handling the situation. That is actually why I am calling." I gripped the steering wheel. The leather squeaked under my fingers. "Handling the situation," I repeated. "Yes," Helen said. "Your father made a few calls this morning. He worked his magic. He found a brilliant way to resolve this little banking mix-up. We want you to come over for a family strategy dinner tonight. We will open a nice bottle of wine, sit down together, and map out the solution. David is coming too. We are going to fix everything." A little banking mix-up. She reduced federal wire fraud and the destruction of my decade-long career to a minor clerical error. The sheer audacity of her delusion was breathtaking. "Dinner?" I asked. 7 o'clock, Helen replied brightly. "I am making those green chili chicken enchiladas you used to love when you were in high school. It will be nice to have everyone under one roof again. We need your sharp compliance brain to help us finalize the paperwork. See you tonight, darling." She disconnected the call before I could respond. I lowered the phone to my lap. The dial tone echoed in my ear. They did not want to apologize. They did not intend to return my money. They wanted my compliance credentials. The trap was resetting itself. The drive back to Santa Fe occurred under a darkening sky. The vibrant orange sunset dissolved into a deep, bruised purple as I navigated the winding highway toward the foothills. I did not go to the police precinct. Handing my dossier to a detective meant surrendering control of the timeline to a sluggish bureaucracy. My HR review board hearing loomed 3 days away. A pending investigation would not clear my defaulted status fast enough to save my security clearance. I needed leverage. I needed a confession. I needed them to hand me the key to my own chains. I parked my sedan in the familiar driveway of the Monte Sereno subdivision. The property lights cast a warm, inviting glow against the custom masonry. I sat in the driver's seat and pulled my smartphone from my pocket. New Mexico operates under a one-party consent law regarding the recording of private conversations. As long as one active participant in the discussion knows the audio is being captured, the recording remains entirely legal and admissible in court. I opened the voice memo application. I pressed the red circle. The timer began ticking forward. I locked the screen and slid the device deep into the interior pocket of my blazer. I walked up the stone pathway and opened the front door. The scent of roasted green chilies, melted Monterey Jack cheese, and seasoned chicken drifted through the foyer. It was a heavy, comforting aroma that instantly triggered a rush of childhood memories. Helen Taylor emerged from the kitchen, wearing a pristine linen apron over a silk blouse. She carried a steaming ceramic casserole dish. She offered a bright, welcoming smile, acting as though we were gathering for a mundane Tuesday evening supper. She set the dish on the formal dining table. "I made your favorite, Euphemia," she announced. "Green chili chicken enchiladas. I remembered how much you loved these during final exams in high school. I thought we could all use a little comfort food tonight." The transparency of the tactic was staggering. She orchestrated a digital smear campaign against me yesterday morning. She stole my life savings 2 days prior. Now she baked a casserole, assuming a plate of seasoned poultry would erase a federal forgery. It was a cheap, emotional manipulation designed to disarm me. She wanted to regress our dynamic back to my adolescence, when I was desperate for her approval and easily controlled by her domestic affection. I walked into the dining room. "Thank you, Helen," I said. My voice revealed nothing. Richard sat at the head of the long mahogany table, pouring a glass of expensive red wine. He looked composed, wrapped in his usual armor of unearned confidence. David paced the length of the hardwood floor. My brother looked nothing like the polished real estate visionary he projected on social media. The bespoke tailoring was gone. He wore a wrinkled dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar. His face shone with a fine sheen of sweat. Dark circles hung heavy under his eyes. He marched back and forth, clutching a crystal tumbler of scotch. He resembled a cornered animal trapped in a gilded cage. He did not greet me. He simply stared at the floorboards, muttering quiet calculations to himself. "Please take a seat, everyone," Helen commanded smoothly. "Let us eat while the food is hot." I pulled out a heavy wooden chair and sat down. Helen served a generous portion of the enchiladas onto my china plate. I picked up my silver fork. I took a bite. The flavors were rich and perfectly balanced. I chewed methodically, letting the silence stretch across the dining room. Dramatic irony saturated the space. My parents and my brother looked at me and saw a naive, defeated subordinate. They assumed the default warning broke my spirit. They believed I came seeking their guidance, desperate to rescue my career. They remained blissfully unaware that a digital microphone was currently recording every breath they took. They had no idea my briefcase contained the DocuSign IP logs and the Taos federal indictment records. Richard cleared his throat and took a sip of his wine. He steepled his fingers, resting them on the table. "We appreciate you coming, Euphemia," he began. His tone mirrored a corporate executive addressing a junior employee. "We understand the automated banking system caused a temporary inconvenience regarding your credit profile." "The bank defaulted my account," I replied, chewing another bite of food. "My compliance director placed me on administrative leave. I face a board hearing on Friday. A temporary setback, Helen interjected, waving her hand dismissively. We will straighten out the Human Resources Department later. Right now, we need to focus on the broader solution. Richard nodded. David is facing an unjust liquidity squeeze, he explained. The federal regulators overstepped their boundaries and temporarily froze the development accounts in Taos. It is an absurd bureaucratic overreach. I watched David pour another measure of scotch into his glass. He did not look like a man dealing with a simple bureaucratic freeze. He looked like a man who knew the Securities and Exchange Commission was preparing a prison cell. We mapped out a recovery strategy, Richard continued. David possesses a brilliant portfolio, but traditional banks are currently gun-shy. We arranged a meeting with a private lending syndicate based in Denver. They provide unregulated bridge capital for high-yield commercial ventures. They are willing to extend David a substantial line of credit to bypass the frozen Taos accounts and launch his next project. I set my fork down. The audacity of the pitch hung in the air. There is one small procedural requirement, Richard said. His voice grew dangerously smooth. The syndicate requires a corporate guarantor to verify the risk assessment. Since my firm is currently restructuring our tax liabilities, my signature carries less weight. David needs a licensed financial compliance officer to formally vouch for his operational integrity. I stared at my father. He did not invite me to dinner to offer an apology. He did not intend to repay the stolen $34,000. He brought me here to demand my professional credentials. My parents wanted me to walk into a room full of unregulated private lenders and legally bind my corporate reputation to David. They wanted me to stamp a seal of approval on a fraudulent shell company. They expected me to commit career suicide and risk a second felony charge willingly. David stopped pacing. He turned toward the table, his face flushed with frantic energy. The SEC ruined my vision, he ranted, pointing a shaking finger at the ceiling. Those government auditors possess zero foresight. Taos was a masterpiece. I designed a paradigm-shifting luxury lodge, and they froze the capital over a technicality. The developer made a clerical error, and the feds shut down the entire operation. He slammed his glass onto the table. The amber liquid splashed over the rim. You need to sign the syndicate paperwork, Euphemia, he demanded. You owe me this. Your little credit default is nothing compared to what I am losing. I am the face of this family. If I fall, the entire Taylor name becomes a joke in Santa Fe. I wiped my mouth with a linen napkin. I cannot vouch for a project under a federal Ponzi scheme indictment, I said, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. David slammed his hand against the mahogany wood. It is not a Ponzi scheme, he shouted. It is a sophisticated investment matrix. You just lack the ambition to understand high-level commercial maneuvering. If you do not sign that guarantor document, the syndicate walks away. If the syndicate walks away, my creditors seize my vehicles. They foreclose on my properties. I will lose everything. His voice cracked, breaking into a high, desperate register. He turned his rage toward Richard. This is your fault, he spat at our father. If you provided the liquid cash I requested last month, I never would have needed the Taos contract. You starved my holding company. You hoarded your resources while I drowned. You need to fix this right now. Give me the capital from your retirement reserves. Richard slammed his own hand against the table, silencing the room. His face darkened. His ego flared, reacting to the direct challenge from his deteriorating son. Richard refused to look weak in his own dining room. He stood up, towering over the table. Do not speak to me about failing, Richard commanded. His voice echoed against the vaulted ceiling. I built this family. I engineered our survival. He pointed a steady, commanding finger at David. You need to calm down and stop acting like a terrified child. Your lifestyle is not in jeopardy. My financial foundation remains untouched. Richard adjusted the lapels of his jacket, puffing his chest. He delivered the final, fatal sentence with supreme, arrogant certainty. Don't panic. My retirement is completely bulletproof, thanks to Taylor Legacy Holdings. We just need Euphemia to handle your side. The dining room went silent. The name hung over the half-eaten plates of food. Taylor Legacy Holdings. I committed the phrase to memory. My pulse remained steady while my mind locked onto the target. I did not answer my father. I stood up from the mahogany table, leaving the half-eaten green chile enchiladas cooling on the china plate. Helen called my name, her voice tight with sudden apprehension, but I did not turn around. I walked out of the formal dining room, through the cedar-scented foyer, and exited the house. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, sealing their chaotic demands inside. The night air in Santa Fe carried a sharp chill, smelling of dry pine and dust. I slid into my sedan, started the engine, and drove down the manicured streets of the Monte Sereno subdivision. The phrase Richard dropped hung in the dark interior of my car. Taylor Legacy Holdings. It was a slip of the tongue, born from a desperate need to assert dominance over his crumbling son, an apex predator displaying his plumage. That singular boast provided the exact coordinates I needed to dismantle his empire. The drive back to Albuquerque felt like navigating through a heavy fog. My mind raced, categorizing the implications of his statement. I reached my apartment shortly before midnight. The familiar quiet of my living space offered no comfort tonight. I dropped my blazer onto the sofa and walked straight into my home office. I switched on the desk lamp, casting a warm yellow pool of light across the glass surface. Sitting near the base of my dual monitors was a framed black and white photograph. I picked it up, holding the cool metal frame in my hands. The image showed my late grandfather Winston Taylor standing in front of his original hardware store in the 1970s. He wore a crisp suit and held a distinct antique silver pocket watch in his right hand. Winston built his fortune through decades of relentless, unglamorous labor. He sold construction supplies, purchased modest commercial lots, and lived far below his means. I remember sitting on his knee as a little girl, listening to the rhythmic ticking of that silver pocket watch. He told me that time and integrity were the only two currencies a person truly owned. When he passed away, he left a substantial estate, trusting his only son to preserve the foundation. Richard inherited the wealth, but despised the grease and grit required to maintain it. He sold the hardware business immediately, preferring the sterile prestige of architectural consulting. The silver pocket watch was a physical symbol of Winston's grueling sacrifice, a legacy my father hoarded while actively destroying his own daughter. I set the photograph down. The sentimental history vanished, replaced by cold, analytical resolve. I woke my workstation and established a secure connection to the state commercial registry. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, the rhythmic sound filling the silent room. I typed the exact phrasing my father used during his dining room rant. The search engine spun for 4 seconds before returning a single match. It was a domestic limited liability company registered in Delaware, a notorious tax haven, offering extreme corporate anonymity. A standard civilian inquiry would hit a brick wall right there. Corporate privacy laws shield the identities of board members and managing directors in these specific jurisdictions. But I held a senior compliance clearance. I bypassed the public portal and utilized a specialized federal tracing matrix designed to peel back corporate veils for anti-money laundering investigations. The software required my unique biometric thumbprint to authorize the deep dive. I routed the Delaware registration number through a secondary banking database to find the attached financial institution. The entity did not map to a standard checking or savings account. It routed directly to an elite private wealth management brokerage firm headquartered in Manhattan. My heart maintained a steady clinical rhythm as I initiated a balance sheet query. The screen buffered, pulling the encrypted ledger data. When the numerical sequence finally populated across my monitor, the breath vanished from my lungs. The account did not hold a modest emergency reserve. It contained hundreds of thousands of dollars in diversified blue-chip stocks, municipal bonds, and highly liquid mutual funds. The portfolio was perfectly insulated, generating a steady stream of passive dividend income. I downloaded the previous 12 months of transaction history. Richard had not touched the principal balance in years. He simply reinvested the dividends, allowing the hoard to grow unchecked in the dark. The ledger displayed a man who valued hoarding capital above all other human connections. He monitored the stock fluctuations with a religious devotion, ensuring his safety net remained impenetrable. The true horror of the situation did not stem from the sheer size of the wealth. It stemmed from the timeline. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, staring at the glowing digits. A deep physical nausea settled into my stomach. When David approached our parents with his catastrophic debt from the fraudulent Taoist development, Richard and Helen faced a choice. They possessed the exact amount of liquid capital required to bail out their golden son. They could have sold a fraction of their municipal bonds. They could have cashed out a single mutual fund without drastically affecting their lifestyle. Instead, they looked at their insulated wealth and decided it was too precious to touch. They explicitly chose to keep their private brokerage account pristine. They looked across the family tree and targeted me. They weighed the value of my decade of grueling corporate labor, my immaculate credit score, and my lifelong dream of traveling to Madrid. They decided my existence was an acceptable casualty. They viewed my independence as an affront to their control, so tearing it down served a dual purpose. It funded David, and it put me back in my place. They authorized a $50,000 shadow loan and drained my legacy savings to spare themselves the minor inconvenience of dipping into grandfather Winston's money. This was not a crime of desperate last resort necessity. It was an act of pure entitled malice. They sacrificed my livelihood so Richard could continue boasting about his bulletproof retirement. They watched me eat dinner tonight, knowing they possessed a fortune, while demanding I surrender my professional credentials to save David. The level of sociopathy required to execute that sequence of events defied basic human decency. I sat in the glow of the dual monitors, letting the anger harden into something sharp and unbreakable. I no longer feared the Human Resources Review Board. I no longer feared the police precinct. I held the key to my own liberation. Richard claimed his retirement was bulletproof. I was a compliance officer. I knew how to shatter the glass. I began drafting a new dossier. I pulled the routing numbers, the account identifiers, and the current market valuations of the holding company. I cross-referenced the data with the DocuSign forgery logs. I built a comprehensive map proving my parents possessed the means to pay David's debt, but actively chose to commit federal identity theft instead. The prosecutors would view this as a predatory, calculated strike rather than a panicked mistake. The criminal intent was undeniable. I printed the balance sheets and the routing disclosures. The heavy laser printer churned in the corner of my office, producing the tangible evidence of their greed. I slid the fresh pages into a new manila folder. My focus narrowed onto the final spreadsheet. I prepared to save the encrypted file to a secure external drive. The silence of the apartment was total, broken only by the hum of the computer fan. Suddenly, my personal smartphone vibrated against the glass desk. It was not a standard text message alert. The device emitted a shrill, continuous alarm designed for critical system warnings. I picked up the phone. The screen flashed a brilliant, pulsing red. It was an active security alert from my banking application. The system was currently detecting a high-level, unauthorized intrusion protocol. The automated banking freeze I triggered earlier that afternoon locked all external transfers, but someone was actively trying to shatter the lock. The notification detailed a live, ongoing attempt to bypass the primary security firewall of my frozen portal. The hacker was not using foreign brute force software or sophisticated decryption algorithms. They were attempting to reset the master password manually, right in that exact moment. The system logged multiple failed login attempts originating from a recognized domestic network. The intruder was trying to answer my deeply personal security questions to unlock the frozen funds and extract more capital. The betrayal was taking on a new, real-time dimension. My blood ran cold as I read the specific security prompt the intruder was currently trying to guess. The glowing red screen of my smartphone illuminated the dark office. A critical security alert from my banking application pulsed in a steady, rhythmic sequence. I stared at the digital interface. The automated freeze I initiated earlier that afternoon locked all external transfers, effectively building a wall around my compromised identity. Now someone was actively trying to scale that wall. The notification detailed a live intrusion protocol. The hacker was not deploying foreign brute force software or running sophisticated decryption algorithms from a remote server. They were attempting a manual password reset originating from a recognized domestic network. The system displayed the geographic ping. The signal originated from the Monte Sereno subdivision in Santa Fe. Richard was sitting in his home office trying to break into my locked accounts. The audacity of the action anchored me to my chair. He had just finished eating dinner with me. He had just boasted about his impenetrable retirement portfolio. Yet the moment I walked out his front door, he retreated to his computer to extract more capital from my name. The $50,000 shadow loan was apparently insufficient to satisfy David's catastrophic debt obligations. My father needed a higher credit limit. He needed to unlock the frozen portal to authorize another fraudulent wire transfer. I opened the secure banking application to monitor the intrusion in real time. The interface provided a live diagnostic view of the login terminal. Richard was failing the primary authentication measures. The system locked him out of the standard password fields. The algorithm forced the intruder into a secondary verification matrix. This protocol required the user to answer a series of legacy security questions established when I first opened the account a decade ago. The screen refreshed, displaying the first prompt. What is your mother's maiden name? The diagnostic log showed the correct input within 3 seconds. Richard knew Helen's history. The screen refreshed again. What street did you grow up on? The correct input registered immediately. The final security barrier appeared on my monitor. This was a custom prompt I had manually typed into the system years ago. It read, "Name of your first pet." I watched the live input feed. A blinking cursor hovered in the empty digital box. 6 letters appeared in slow, deliberate sequence. B, U, S, T, E, R. The air left my lungs. The temperature in my home office seemed to drop 10 degrees. The input field accepted the answer. The system granted partial access before my manual hard freeze slammed the final door shut, blocking the ultimate transaction. Richard had the correct answer, but the security override held firm. The emotional impact of those 6 letters struck deeper than the theft of the money. Buster was a golden retriever puppy. Richard and Helen purchased him for my 7th birthday. They viewed the dog as an aesthetic accessory, a prop designed to make our family portrait look idyllic for their country club peers. But a living animal requires patience and grace. Buster possessed boundless energy. He tracked mud across the imported Persian rugs. He shed golden fur onto the cashmere sofas. He scratched the pristine hardwood floors in the foyer. He was a creature of joyful chaos in a house that demanded sterile perfection. Richard despised him. When I was 10 years old, I returned home from the 5th grade. I walked through the front door and called for the dog. The house was entirely silent. The water bowl was missing from the kitchen. The leash was gone from the utility hook. Richard sat in his leather armchair reading a financial journal. He told me the gardener left the side gate open and the dog ran away. I spent 3 weeks crying, searching the neighborhood, and hanging handmade flyers on telephone poles. My father watched my grief with cold detachment. 5 years later, during a holiday dinner, Richard drank 3 glasses of expensive red wine. He engaged in a conversation with a business partner about the nuisance of domestic pets. In a moment of arrogant candor, he laughed and admitted he had driven Buster to a county shelter 2 towns over while I was at school. He discarded the animal because the dog ruined a custom pair of Italian leather shoes. He lied to my face for 5 years to avoid a tantrum. Now sitting in his luxury home, Richard typed that exact name into a banking portal to steal my financial future. He used the memory of a dog he discarded to bypass a security wall. It was the ultimate, intimate violation of my boundaries. He weaponized a childhood trauma to to authorize a felony. A profound shift occurred in my chest. The residual tether of family loyalty, the invisible cord that bound me to their approval, snapped. The break was clean and irreversible. I realized in that quiet moment that my parents would never stop consuming my resources. They viewed me as a designated utility, a well to be pumped dry whenever David required hydration. If I paid the $50,000 bank loan, they would return next year for $100,000. If I surrendered my professional credentials to the private lending syndicate, they would eventually demand the deed to my apartment. They possessed no moral perimeter. Appeasement was suicide. They would only stop when the machinery enabling their theft was forcefully dismantled. I stopped playing defense. I closed the live security feed on my smartphone. I turned my attention to the dual monitors on my desk. In my corporate life, I dismantled corrupt supply chains and penalized fraudulent contractors. I operated with surgical precision, relying on undeniable data to execute corporate penalties. I needed to treat the Taylor family as a hostile corporate entity. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and retrieved a stack of premium ivory bond paper. It was heavy, dense material used for executive summaries and federal disclosures. I loaded the tray into the laser printer. I retrieved a black leather presentation portfolio from my supply cabinet. The portfolio featured internal locking rings and structured, transparent dividers. It was a vessel designed to deliver severe consequences. I began compiling the lethal dossier. I opened the first digital folder. I sent the DocuSign forgery logs to the printer, a machine word to life, delivering the pages with crisp black text. These sheets detailed the exact timestamps and the Monte Sereno geolocation, proving Richard authorized the shadow loan. I placed them behind the first transparent divider. This established the primary felony. I opened the second folder. I printed the Securities and Exchange Commission restricted dossier regarding the Taos developer. The pages outlined the intricate mechanics of the interstate Ponzi scheme. I placed them behind the second divider. This established the destination of the stolen funds, demonstrating reckless endangerment of my capital. I opened the third folder. I printed the archived correspondence Aunt Kiara provided. The emails showed David asking a downtown bankruptcy attorney how to discharge his liabilities once the Taos venture collapsed. The timestamp proved he drafted the inquiry 3 days before my signature was forged. I placed these pages behind the third divider. This established the premeditated conspiracy. My brother engineered the financial ruin intentionally. I opened the final folder. I printed the encrypted balance sheets and the tax routing records for Taylor Legacy Holdings. The ledger proved Richard possessed hundreds of thousands of dollars in hoarded liquid wealth. He held the exact resources required to pay David's debt, but chose identity theft instead to preserve his own portfolio. I placed these pages behind the final divider. This established the presence of entitled malice. I snapped the metal rings of the leather portfolio shut. The binder carried physical weight. It held the power to destroy my father's country club prestige, my mother's vanity, and my brother's synthetic empire. I turned back to my workstation and opened my corporate email client. A confrontation on their terrace or in their dining room offered them the home field advantage. They thrived in domestic spaces where they could weaponize childhood dynamics and serve green chili enchiladas as a distraction. I needed to strip away their environmental armor. I needed to place them in a sterile arena where logic dictated the outcome. I drafted a new message. I entered the email addresses for Richard, Helen, and David. I kept the subject line brief and devoid of emotion. Settlement Resolution Meeting. I moved to the body of the email. I did not include a greeting. I did not reference the dinner I had just abandoned. I typed a single, declarative sentence requesting their presence. I opened the location tab and selected a downtown corporate office building where my logistics firm maintained a neutral, glass-walled conference room for vendor arbitrations. The space featured a polished mahogany table, smart screens, and zero sentimental value. I set the time for 9 a.m. on Thursday. It provided them exactly 36 hours to panic. I attached the calendar invitation to the message. The digital prompt asked for confirmation. I stared at the screen, letting the reality of the impending execution settle over my shoulders. I was inviting my family to their own dismantling. I pressed send. The email vanished into the outbound queue, initiating the final sequence. I arrived at the downtown corporate plaza at 7 in the morning. The glass and steel tower dominated the Albuquerque skyline, reflecting the pale morning light. I swiped my security badge at the lobby turnstile and rode the silent elevator to the 14th floor. The logistics firm dedicated this specific wing to vendor arbitrations and hostile contract negotiations. It was an environment engineered to strip away emotion and enforce cold logic. The air conditioning hummed a low, steady frequency. The scent of roasted green chilies and domestic history did not exist here. The air smelled only of filtered ozone and lemon floor polish. I walked into the primary conference room. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed view of the high desert, while frosted glass interior walls provided total visual isolation from the outer hallways. A long mahogany table anchored the center of the space, surrounded by structured leather chairs. I chose this room for a specific tactical reason. My parents thrived in environments they controlled. They weaponized their manicured terrace and their formal dining room, using domestic familiarity to enforce their hierarchy. By summoning them to a sterile corporate arena, I removed their environmental armor. They possessed no geographic authority here. I set my briefcase on the table and unclasped the brass locks. I extracted the 3 black leather presentation portfolios I had compiled 2 nights prior. I did not hire a slick attorney to sit beside me. Lawyers introduced theatrics and billable hours. I relied solely on raw, indisputable data. I placed one portfolio at the head of the table for Richard. I placed the second on the right for Helen. I set the third on the left for David. I ran my hand over the cover of the nearest binder. Inside rested the dense ivory bond paper holding the DocuSign forgery, timestamps, the Taos Ponzi indictment, the premeditated bankruptcy emails, and the hidden ledger for Taylor Legacy Holdings. The paper carried physical weight. I intentionally selected the heaviest stock available in the supply cabinet. I wanted the consequences of their actions to feel tangible in their hands. They spent a decade treating my identity and my resources as abstract concepts. Today, the reality would carry a distinct physical gravity. I took my seat at the far end of the mahogany table. I folded my hands, resting them on the polished wood. A profound psychological shift settled over my posture. For 31 years, I operated as the subordinate daughter seeking approval from a regime that viewed me as a disposable asset. I absorbed their critiques. I tolerated their unearned arrogance. That dynamic ended the moment my father typed the name of a discarded childhood pet into a banking security prompt. I no longer sat in the victim chair. I occupied the seat of the executioner. I set a logical trap grounded entirely in financial reality. At 8:55, the frosted glass doors of the outer lobby parted. I watched through the translucent panels as Richard, Helen, and David approached the conference room. They walked with the relaxed, synchronized cadence of people who believed they had already won the war. They completely misread the tone of the calendar invitation. They assumed the sterile environment was merely a formality, a quiet place for me to sign the guarantor documents for David's private lending syndicate. The heavy oak door swung inward. Richard entered first, wearing a tailored navy suit and a silk tie. He projected the aura of a benevolent patriarch, arriving to accept an apology. Helen followed close behind, dressed in a sharp beige pencil skirt and a cashmere cardigan. She carried her designer handbag and a small decorative paper gift bag. David brought up the rear. My brother looked remarkably different from the frantic, sweating man pacing the dining room 2 nights ago. He had showered, shaved, and donned a bespoke charcoal jacket. He carried a leather folio tucked under his arm, presuming it held the syndicate contracts awaiting my signature. "Good morning, Euphemia," Helen sang out, her voice echoing too brightly against the glass walls. She walked toward my end of the table and placed the small decorative bag near my hands. "I brought you a little something," she continued, offering a practiced, warm smile. "I saw it in a boutique window yesterday and thought of you. I know this week has felt a bit tense, but we are here to smooth everything over." I did not touch the bag. I looked at the tissue paper protruding from the top. A thin, translucent piece of fabric peeked through the wrapping. It was a cheap silk scarf featuring a chaotic floral print. Helen purchased a discount accessory to serve as a faux apology gift. She believed a $20 piece of fabric would smooth over a $50,000 federal identity theft. The scarf represented our entire family dynamic. It was a flimsy reality disguised by expensive tissue paper. "Please take your seats," I said, keeping my voice flat and clinical. Helen's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she recovered quickly. She glided to the chair on the right. Richard took the head of the table, adjusting his suit jacket as he sat. David dropped into the seat on the left, placing his leather folio on the mahogany wood. He looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows, admiring the view of the city. "Nice setup you have here," David remarked, drumming his fingers on the table. "A bit sterile for my taste, but it gets the job done. Let us knock out this paperwork. I have a conference call with the Denver syndicate at 11. I did not respond to my brother. I kept my eyes fixed on Richard. My father surveyed the room. He noticed the 3 black leather portfolios resting in front of them, but he assumed they contained the standard corporate disclosures required for my guarantor's signature. He leaned back in his ergonomic chair, crossing his legs. He steepled his fingers, a classic gesture of manufactured authority. He cleared his throat, preparing to deliver a speech. Euphemia Richard began, his tone dripping with patronizing patience. "I want to commend you for calling this meeting. It takes maturity to step back from an emotional reaction and view the broader financial picture. Your mother and I understand that the automated banking default caused you a degree of professional distress." He paused, letting his words hang in the filtered air. He intended to frame my capitulation as a noble sacrifice. "Family loyalty is the ultimate currency," Richard continued. "Your grandfather Winston built his hardware empire by understanding that blood requires investment." David encountered a temporary hurdle with his mountain development project. The federal regulators overstepped their boundaries. By lending your pristine compliance credentials to his Denver syndicate application today, you are protecting the Taylor legacy. You are ensuring that your brother's vision survives this bureaucratic interference. Once the new capital flows, we will clear up your little credit anomaly at the local bank. We operate as a unified front. He unsteepled his fingers and gestured toward the black leather binder resting in front of him. "I assume these are the signature pages," he asked. I did not nod. I did not shake my head. I sat in absolute silence, absorbing the sheer scale of his delusion. He invoked the name of the grandfather whose wealth he currently hoarded in a secret Delaware shell company. He asked me to bind my name to a known Ponzi scheme in the name of family unity. He offered to fix a felony forgery as though it were a simple accounting error. Helen shifted in her chair, unnerved by my lack of response. "Euphemia," she prompted softly, "your father asked you a question. Let us sign the documents and go get an early lunch." I ignored my mother. I looked past Richard's tailored shoulder toward the entrance of the conference room. The heavy oak door clicked open. The sound severed Richard's patronizing aura. David turned his head, annoyed by the interruption. Helen blinked, staring at the threshold. Mr. Sterling walked into the room. The bank manager did not wear his usual welcoming retail smile. He wore a dark, rigid suit. His posture reflected the gravity of his profession. He stepped onto the carpeted floor carrying a thick, standardized enforcement binder. Stamped across the front cover in stark gold lettering was the official seal of the Federal Fraud Division. He closed the oak door behind him, sealing the 5 of us inside the glass walls. Mr. Sterling walked the length of the conference room. His leather shoes produced a measured, rhythmic sound against the low-pile corporate carpet. He bypassed the empty chairs on the sides and took the seat directly to my right. He placed the thick federal enforcement binder onto the mahogany surface. The heavy thud echoed against the frosted glass walls. Richard frowned. His steepled fingers dropped flat against the table. The arrival of a stern, unfamiliar executive disrupted his carefully rehearsed narrative. My father adjusted his silk tie, attempting to project unbothered authority. "I assume you are the internal notary," Richard said. His voice carried a dismissive edge. "We brought our identification to finalize the guarantor paperwork for my son. We have a tight schedule today." Mr. Sterling did not smile. He did not reach for a pen. "I'm the senior branch manager of the financial institution holding the collateral loan," Mr. Taylor, the banker, replied. "I am here as a fiduciary witness to a federal crime." The color drained from Helen's face. The practiced warmth vanished from her features, leaving behind a rigid mask of sudden apprehension. David stopped drumming his fingers on the table. He stared at the federal seal stamped in gold foil across the cover of Sterling's binder. I reached forward and pressed a button on the embedded table console. A smart screen descended from the ceiling panel behind me. The room dimmed slightly as the high-resolution projector hummed to life. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a domestic greeting. I looked at the three people sitting across the polished wood. "Open the leather portfolios," I instructed. Nobody moved for a long moment. The silence in the room grew dense and suffocating. Helen's decorative paper bag rested near my elbow. The cheap floral silk scarf spilled over the rim. It sat inches away from the thick printed stack of federal wire fraud statutes resting inside my open portfolio. The contrast highlighted the profound absurdity of her manipulation. She brought discount fabric to a felony arbitration. "Open the portfolios," I repeated. My tone held the sterile command of a senior auditor directing a hostile review. Richard reached out with a hesitant hand. He flipped open the cover of his binder. Helen and David mirrored the action. The rustle of heavy ivory bond paper filled the quiet space. "Turn to the first transparent divider," I said. I tapped a key on my laptop. The projector illuminated the smart screen displaying the encrypted DocuSign audit log. The digital numbers glowed stark and undeniable in the dim light. On October 17th at 1:15 in the morning, someone bypassed my secondary security protocols. I began. My delivery remained surgical. I dealt only in dates and dollars. They drained my legacy savings account, extracting $34,000 in cash. 45 minutes later, they executed a forged electronic signature. They authorized a $50,000 collateral loan against my credit profile. Richard opened his mouth, preparing to deploy his fabricated tax panic story. I pressed the remote control, severing his defense before he could speak a single word. The screen zoomed in, highlighting a specific row of metadata. The digital footprint did not originate from an anonymous server, I stated. The geolocation coordinates traced directly to the primary router in the Monte Sereno subdivision. You did not secure a temporary bridge loan. You committed identity theft. You triggered an automated risk algorithm that defaulted my account and placed my corporate security clearance under review. Richard closed his mouth, his jaw clenched. The undeniable physical evidence stripped away his ability to gaslight the room. David shifted in his leather chair. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. He looked at the IP logs and attempted to salvage the meeting. "This is a vast misunderstanding, Euphemia," my brother said. His voice carried a nervous tremor. "The capital is safe. We deployed the funds into a highly lucrative commercial venture. The Denver syndicate will clear this up by tomorrow afternoon. We just need you to sign the guarantor release." I pressed the remote again. The screen shifted from the DocuSign logs to the crimson banner of the federal database. "Turn to the second divider," I instructed. The three of them turned the heavy pages. They stared at the Securities and Exchange Commission restricted dossier. "The funds did not go toward a legitimate commercial venture," I explained. "The routing numbers show the exact sum of $84,000 wired directly into a development holding company in Taos, New Mexico. The federal government sealed a criminal indictment against that developer 2 weeks ago. He operates a multi-state Ponzi scheme. The authorities seized the properties. The accounts are frozen. The money is gone." David's breathing turned shallow. He stared at the SEC documents. He tried to speak, but his throat seized. Richard turned his head slowly, looking at his golden son. The patriarch realized his $50,000 risk was buried deep inside a federal crime scene. The Denver syndicate was a fantasy, but the true magnitude of the betrayal remained hidden. I waited for the reality of the frozen funds to settle over the table before playing the final card. "Turn to the third divider," I said. I clicked the remote. The screen displayed the archived correspondence Aunt Kiara had intercepted from David's office. "Read the timestamps," I said. My voice dropped to a cold whisper. Helen looked at the paper. Her eyes scanned the printed text. The text outlined David's inquiry to a downtown bankruptcy attorney. The email detailed his knowledge of the fraudulent Taos Shell Company and his plan to discharge the attached corporate liabilities once the federal authorities arrived. 3 days before my signature was forged, David drafted that email, I stated. Helen gasped. The sound tore through the sterile room. She looked at her son. The illusion of the perfect air shattered into jagged pieces. David did not fall victim to a smooth-talking fraudster. I explained, watching my brother shrink into his chair. He identified a sinking ship and decided to throw his debt into the cargo hold. He convinced his parents to steal my identity and secure the bank loan. He planned to let the government freeze the fraudulent accounts. He intended to file for corporate bankruptcy and walk away with clean hands. He orchestrated the entire sequence to dump the $50,000 liability onto my credit profile. He engineered my financial ruin to save himself. The Taylor family hierarchy imploded. The pristine veneer burned away, leaving only raw panic and toxic resentment. Helen burst into tears. She pressed her hands against her face, playing the tragic victim. She wept over the betrayal, mourning the destruction of her carefully curated social image. She cried for the golden son who used her, rather than the daughter whose life they nearly destroyed. David pushed his chair back. The heavy wood scraped harshly against the carpet. He pointed a shaking finger at Richard. "You ruined my life," David yelled. His voice cracked, echoing off the frosted glass panels. "If you just gave me the liquid cash I requested last month, I never would have touched that Taos deal. You forced me to find outside capital. You secured a dirty loan using a forged signature. You tied me to a federal felony." Richard stood up. His face flushed a dark mottled purple. The veins in his neck pulsed against his pristine silk collar. He slammed his fists onto the mahogany table, rattling the coffee cups. "Shut off that projector," Richard commanded. His voice shook with unfiltered panic. "Turn off the screen right now, Euphemia. This is family business. We do not discuss these matters in front of an outsider." He glared at Mr. Sterling, attempting to intimidate the bank manager with his country club bluster. Mr. Sterling did not flinch. He adjusted his glasses and met my father's furious gaze. "I am not an outsider, Mr. Taylor," the bank manager said quietly. "I am the fiduciary officer required by law to report identity theft to the authorities. You signed a binding financial contract using false pretenses. The institution I represent is the primary victim of your fraud." Richard stared at the bank manager. The reality of the federal enforcement binders sitting on the table finally registered in his mind. His breathing turned rapid and shallow. He looked at me, his eyes wide with cornered desperation. The arrogant patriarch vanished, replaced by a man staring directly into the abyss of a prison sentence. He had no remaining leverage. His son was a traitor. His wife was weeping. His legacy was a printed crime scene. I reached into my briefcase. I extracted a single sheet of heavy ivory bond paper. I laid it flat on the polished mahogany. I placed my fingertips on the edge of the page and pushed. The document slid smoothly across the long table, gliding over the reflective wood. It stopped directly in front of my father. The printed ledger detailed the exact balance of his beloved secret slush fund. The header read, "Taylor Legacy Holdings." Richard stared at the single sheet of ivory bond paper resting on the polished wood. The printed digits represented his hidden sanctuary. The ledger laid bare the exact balance of Taylor Legacy Holdings, the private brokerage account he funded with my grandfather's inheritance. For years, my father operated under the assumption that his financial intellect was superior to everyone in his orbit. He believed his offshore maneuvers and corporate shells were impenetrable. He never anticipated his own daughter possessing the compliance credentials required to map his hidden treasury. His hands rested flat against the mahogany surface. A fine tremor originated in his knuckles and traveled down his fingers, visible under the bright fluorescent lighting of the conference room. His pristine country club reputation, his entire identity as a bulletproof patriarch, was evaporating in real time. The illusion of his sacrifice dissolved. The paper proved he possessed hundreds of thousands of dollars in liquid assets. He hoarded his wealth and actively chose to forge my signature rather than sell a single municipal bond. David leaned forward in his chair. He looked at the document sitting in front of our father. My brother possessed enough business acumen to read a standard balance sheet. He registered the sum at the bottom of the column. He saw the dates of the dividend reinvestments extending back a decade. "You had the capital," David said. His voice was barely a whisper, stripped of its usual bravado. "You sat at the dinner table and told me you were tapped out. You watched me panic over the subprime lenders. You knew I was drowning." Richard did not look at his son. He kept his eyes locked on the ivory paper. "You let me beg," David continued, the volume of his voice rising with each syllable. "You let me sign that fraudulent Taos contract. You pushed me into a federal crime scene because you refused to touch your precious portfolio. You sacrificed my freedom to protect your mutual funds." The family hierarchy collapsed. The structure that governed our lives for 3 decades shattered inside the glass walls of the corporate suite. The designated golden child realized he was nothing more than a liability to the patriarch. The devoted mother sat weeping, stripped of her social vanity. The obedient daughter occupied the seat of the executioner, holding the federal evidence. I did not allow the domestic argument to consume the remaining time. I needed to execute the settlement. "We are finished discussing the past," I announced. My voice cut through the rising tension in the room. "I am offering you 3 distinct paths to resolve this situation. You will select one of them before anyone leaves this chamber." Mr. Sterling opened the heavy enforcement binder resting to my right. He produced a blank, standardized repayment agreement and set it on the table. The bank manager unclipped a silver fountain pen from his breast pocket and laid it beside the document. "Option 1, I said, holding up a single finger. "You liquidate Taylor Legacy Holdings today. You authorize an immediate wire transfer to satisfy the $50,000 shadow loan. You restore my original $34,000 travel fund with the accrued interest. Mr. Sterling will process the documents and release the default flag from my profile." Richard swallowed hard. The tremor in his hands intensified. "Option 2, I continued, raising a second finger. "You refuse the repayment. Mr. Sterling walks out of this building and submits the DocuSign IP logs to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The authorities will issue warrants for identity theft and wire fraud. The police will arrive at the Monte Sereno subdivision by tomorrow morning." David gripped the arms of his leather chair. The color drained entirely from his face. "Option 3, I concluded, raising a third finger. You attempt to shift the blame onto David. I hand the archived bankruptcy emails to the Securities and Exchange Commission. I prove my brother acted as a willing co-conspirator in the Taos Ponzi scheme. He goes down for federal fraud and faces a minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary." The quiet hum of the air conditioning filled the silence following the ultimatum. I laid out the stark reality of their choices. There was no room for negotiation. There were no emotional loopholes to exploit. I cornered them with mathematics and the penal code. Richard attempted to salvage a final shred of his ego. He drew a deep breath, trying to steady his shaking hands. He pulled his shoulders back, aiming for his familiar posture of boardroom dominance. "You cannot touch that account, Euphemia," he stated. His voice wavered, lacking its usual resonant depth. "Taylor Legacy Holdings is an irrevocable entity. It is shielded by a protective trust structure. Federal law prohibits the sudden liquidation of those assets to satisfy an external civil dispute. You are bluffing." The attempt at legal posturing was pathetic. He was deploying vocabulary he heard on golf courses, hoping to intimidate a woman who audited corporate tax havens for a living. I leaned forward.